Lila had been raised alongside several tigers, and her bond with one of them was nothing short of remarkable. When she left, she assumed he would forget her completely. She was warned not to visit him again after so many years, but what happened when she saw him again would prove everyone wrong. Lila Harper and her mother, Nora, were thrilled at the prospect of reuniting with the animals they had once loved so deeply. They traveled by jeep through the dense jungles of Varna, a remote region known for its sprawling wildlife reserves, until they spotted the tigers lounging in a clearing near a riverbank. They were eager to approach, but their guides had cautioned them to keep their distance. These animals had been living in the wild for years and might not take kindly to human presence. Lila, however, wasn't convinced. In her heart, she believed the tigers would remember her as fondly as she remembered them. They were family, or so she hoped. These tigers had formed their own prides in the wild, living free from the constraints of captivity. Getting too close was dangerous, or so everyone said. Lila, stubborn as ever, didn't listen. As the jeep rumbled closer to the river, she saw flashes of orange and black between the trees, tigers watching them intently. Among them, Lila instantly recognized the one she had raised, even though he had grown into a majestic, powerful creature. The jeep came to a stop, and despite warnings from Nora and the guides, Lila stepped out. The tiger, Raju, approached. Once a tiny cub she had cradled in her arms, he now moved with a commanding grace, his amber eyes locked on her. He patted closer, muscles rippling under his striped coat. Nora tensed, wanting to intervene, but she knew startling a tiger could make things worse. If something went wrong, Lila was on her own. Raju came closer still, and then, in a swift motion, he nudged Lila's hand with his massive head. Nora froze, fearing the worst. Had Lila's trust in her old friend been misplaced? Would this wild creature, now a king of the jungle, harm her? Lila, however, stood her ground, her heart steady. She couldn't believe her childhood companion would ever hurt her. The extraordinary bond between Lila and Raju had begun years ago, rooted in her mother Nora's mission to protect wildlife. Nora had founded the Harper Sanctuary, a non-profit dedicated to rescuing endangered animals, particularly tigers, and reintroducing them to the wild. When rehabilitation wasn't possible, the animals found a home at the Verdant Refuge, a sanctuary in the coastal town of Solara. Lila and her siblings grew up in this sanctuary, surrounded by animals and forming deep connections with them. Lila was just a toddler when Suri, an injured tiger cub, arrived at the sanctuary. Poachers had killed his family, leaving him alone and wounded. Nora and her team nursed him back to health, and Lila, barely 2 years old, was often nearby, watching with wide-eyed wonder. As she grew, she spent hours near Suri's enclosure, talking to him and tossing toys over the fence. Suri became her playmate, his playful pounces and gentle nuzzles making her childhood magical. Years later, when Lila was 10, Nora came home with a surprise. A tiny tiger cub, Raju, had been orphaned after his mother was killed in a snare. Too young to survive on his own, he needed constant care. Unlike most sanctuary animals, Raju couldn't be placed in an enclosure right away. Tigers thrive in close-knit groups, and this cub needed a family. Lila, now old enough to help, took on the role of his caretaker. She bottle-fed him, comforted him during thunderstorms, and slept near his crate to keep him calm. Raju was like a sibling, but one who grew far faster than any human. It wasn't long before Raju outgrew their home. A tiger isn't a house pet, after all. It was time for him to move to the sanctuary's enclosure. To ensure he wouldn't be lonely, the team introduced him to Suri, the older tiger. They were cautious. Suri was much larger, and a clash could be deadly. The first meeting was through a reinforced gate, where the two tigers sniffed each other curiously. Suri, surprisingly gentle, batted playfully at Raju's paws. When the team finally let them share an enclosure, the two became inseparable, bounding through the grass together. Lila was allowed to visit them, and both tigers greeted her with affectionate headbutts and low, rumbling purrs. They never showed jealousy, only warmth toward her. Convincing the public that this friendship was safe, however, was another matter entirely. Now, years later in the jungles of Varna, Lila stood face to face with Raju. His nudge turned into a gentle lean, his massive frame pressing against her as he let out a soft chuff, a tiger's version of a greeting. Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she stroked his fur, feeling the same connection they'd shared all those years ago. The guides and Nora exhaled in relief, astonished by the reunion. Raju hadn't forgotten her. Their bond, forged in the sanctuary and tested by time, was as strong as ever. Lila was used to slipping into the tiger enclosure at the verdant refuge in Solara whenever she pleased. Spending time with the big cats was as natural to her as breathing, so she didn't think twice about it when a documentary crew arrived to film at the sanctuary. They likely thought the world would adore seeing her unique bond with the tigers, but the reaction was far from what they expected. The public was outraged that Lila, or any child, was allowed to interact so closely with tigers without strict safety protocols. The backlash was fierce, and the sanctuary received an ultimatum: implement safety measures or face closure. Overnight, Lila was barred from touching her closest companions, Raju and Suri. Now, she could only watch them through the reinforced glass of their enclosure. At 12, she was old enough to know the rule didn't come from her mother, Nora, but too young to fully grasp that it was for her safety. The tigers didn't understand either. They longed to play with their friend and were visibly upset when kept apart. The sight of their confusion broke Lila's heart. Every day after school, Lila would rush to the sanctuary and sit by the glass barrier. As soon as Raju and Suri spotted her, they'd bound over, only to be stopped by the cold, unyielding surface. Raju would let out a low, mournful chuff, pressing his massive paw against the glass. Lila would place her hand on her side, mirroring him, her eyes stinging as she saw his longing to be close. It was a painful separation, but safety wasn't the only reason for the distance. The tigers needed to prepare for life in the wild. They were strong and mature enough to return to their natural habitat, and that meant relying on each other, not humans. The sanctuary team began limiting all interactions to help them adjust to a wilder existence. For months, Nora and her team trained Raju and Suri for survival in the jungle. The Harper Sanctuary's mission had always been to rescue and release animals when possible, and now it was time for the tigers to go. Despite Lila's heavy heart, she knew this was the goal they'd work toward. When the day came, they prepared to send the tigers to a protected reserve in the jungles of Kalindra, a vast wilderness where they could roam free yet be safe from poachers. Lila was allowed a final moment with Raju and Suri. She wrapped her arms around their thick, striped necks, feeling their warmth as they leaned into her, their soft chuffs vibrating against her. It was a fleeting goodbye, a bond now stretched across continents. Lila watched as the tigers were gently sedated and placed in crates for the journey. The truck rumbled away, carrying them toward their new home in Kalindra. It was the life they were meant for, but for Lila, it felt like losing family. She might never see them again. Years passed. Nora visited Kalindra once to check on the tigers and returned with joyful news. Raju and Suri had joined a small pride and were thriving in the wild, living as true jungle kings. Seeing them surrounded by other tigers, free and fierce, made the sacrifice worthwhile, even if it left an ache in Lila's heart. She thought of them often, her childhood playmates now legends in her mind. More than a decade later, the tigers were fully wild, wary of humans and uninterested in contact. Lila, now an adult working for the Harper Sanctuary, was cautioned against ever trying to see them again. It would only taint her memories, people said. They wouldn't know her anymore. But when Nora faced a health scare, everything changed. Determined to revisit her favorite place in the world, she planned a trip to Kalindra as soon as she recovered. She wanted to catch a glimpse of the tigers one last time. When Lila heard about the plan, she insisted on going too. She had to see Raju, the cub she'd raised, now a wild tiger. Despite warnings from colleagues that the tigers had changed and wouldn't recognize her, Lila was undeterred. Nora, understanding her daughter's heart, agreed she could come. Seeing them in their true home would bring her closure, whatever the outcome. The journey to Kalindra was grueling. They flew to a coastal city, then took an off-road vehicle deep into the jungle to a base camp near the reserve. From there, they traveled by small boat along a winding river to search for Raju's pride. The dense forest had no trails or airstrips, so the river was their only path. They'd stay at the camp for several days, giving them multiple chances to spot the tigers if the first attempt failed. As they glided along the river, Lila's heart raced. She scanned the trees, hoping for a glimpse of orange fur. The guides reiterated their warnings. These were wild tigers now, unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Lila barely listened, her eyes fixed on the jungle. Then she saw him, Raju, his stripes vivid against the green, watching from the bank. The boat slowed, and against the guide's protests, Lila stepped onto the shore. Raju's gaze locked onto hers, and he moved toward her with slow, deliberate steps. For a moment, time stood still. Then Raju closed the distance, brushing his massive head against Lila's hand, his familiar chuff filling the air. Nora and the guide stood frozen, awestruck. Raju hadn't forgotten. The bond forged in a sanctuary in Solara, tested by years in wilderness, held strong. Lila's tears fell as she stroked his fur, knowing this reunion was worth every risk. Before setting out at dawn, the guides at the Kalindra Reserve gathered Lila and Nora for a stern briefing. Their expressions were serious as they laid out the rules. No immediate approaches to the tigers. The guides would observe the animals first, and only if they deemed the tigers calm could Lila and Nora get closer. Under no circumstances were they allowed to touch or interact with the tigers. Raju and Suri might have been familiar once, but they were wild now, unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The warning hung heavy in the air. As the small boat glided along the river on their first day of searching, Lila and Nora caught glimpses of amber eyes glinting through the dense foliage. The tigers were watching, just as curious about the intruders as the humans were about them. Lila's breath caught in her throat. There they were, Raju and Suri, transformed by years in the wild but unmistakable. Her heart swelled at the sight, but when Raju bounded forward and pressed his massive body against her, fear gripped her. Her legs trembled, threatening to give way. She looked into his familiar amber eyes and saw a spark of recognition. Then, in a gesture that echoed their long-ago farewell, Raju gently nudged his head against hers. Lila's hand instinctively reached for his fur, stroking it as she had when he was a frightened cub. He responded with a soft chuff, rubbing his cheek against her arm. A clear hello. Suri approached next, his movements slow and deliberate. Like Raju, he seemed to know her. Despite the years and their wildness, they recognized the woman before them as the girl who'd once played with them. Suri extended a paw, gently brushing it along Lila's cheek. Nora stepped closer, and the tigers reacted with playful energy, tumbling around her with surprising care. They seemed to understand they could roughhouse with Nora, but needed to be gentler with Lila. The rest of the pride lingered at the edge of the clearing, watching as Lila and Nora marveled at the tigers' natural home. But Raju and Suri wanted to stay close to the humans who'd been their first family. The guides were stunned. They hadn't expected the tigers to revert so quickly to the affectionate creatures they'd once been. It was clear they'd missed Lila and Nora, but their bond with Lila was especially profound, marked by a tenderness that spoke of deep love. When it was time to return to the boat, the tigers let out low, mournful chuffs, as if afraid of losing their friend again. The sight was heart-wrenching. They spent another day with the tigers, soaking in every moment. As the final goodbye loomed, Lila knew it might be forever. There was no guarantee she'd return. The tigers seemed to sense her sorrow. Suri pressed close, nuzzling her with gentle insistence, reluctant to let go. Lila's tears fell as she eased his paws away. Then she stood before Raju, the cub she'd raised, who held a special place in her heart. He lowered his head to her chest, and she kissed his forehead, whispering, "I love you." With a heavy heart, she boarded the boat. Raju and Suri stood on the riverbank, watching as the boat drifted away. Lila was forever grateful she'd ignored the warnings not to come. The reunion was an experience she'd never trade, proof that her love for the tigers was reciprocated, a bond unbroken by years and distance. They belonged in the wild, and Lila would return to Solara to continue her work at the Harper Sanctuary, saving more animals, carrying the memory of Raju and Suri with her always.